Being a programmer is a lot like being a magician. Since you control exactly what the user sees, you can do things behind the scenes to create amazing illusions. And that's exactly what we're going to do to make it look like the character is running through an endless world. What will actually happen behind the scenes in scene view is that the background is going to be a program to create a move left by two of the exact same image repeated twice. So what we'll do is get the width of one of those repeating sections, and as soon as the background has moved that distance, we'll reset it to its starting position. And the player will be none the wiser. As soon as we figure out how to... Here's the tricky part. The code that detects when the player hits an obstacle is in the player controller's script, and the code that controls the background is in the repeat background script. Somehow, the repeat background script needs to know when something happens in the player controller script. That way, when the player controller script detects when the player has run into the obstacle, the repeat background script can stop. We'll have to figure out how to make these two scripts talk to each other, how to communicate. We'll have to learn the ancient art of script communication. And to make all that happen, I'll see you in Unity. Okay, cool. So we have our little character here, happily jumping along through the forest, and occasionally that obstacle comes through. But we do have a larger problem where, because we're making it look like the character's running through the woods, in fact, it's our background that's running away from our character. So we need to figure out a way that we can actually fix that. And I have a little bit of an idea. So one thing that I could do is actually, if I select our background and I Control D to duplicate, I can create another background, and then I can just keep creating these backgrounds over and over again, and then it'll just look like the player's running through. However, that's probably one of the worst ways that I could actually solve this problem, because then I'll just have maybe like 50 or 100 of these backgrounds that are just constantly moving all across the player, and eventually they do run out, so I can't actually make that infinite, and it'll actually create some big problems for making sure that our game plays well as it's trying to render all of these different scenes that are moving through the scene. So, another option is if we delete this background, because I don't think that solution is a very good idea at all. Another way that we can think about this problem is we actually have this background here, and if you look at the halfway point, just about there, you can see that the background actually repeats itself. So it's got the same trees, and it's got the same rocks at the end. So we already have our own little repeating background. And actually, we can think of the problem in this way, where if you take a look at the player screen, as we move the background over, just about at this point here, it looks like the background is exactly the same. And so what we can do is precisely at this point, we can actually just reset our background, and it will look like the player is constantly running through an endless background, when in fact it's just these two images next to each other, and we're just constantly putting it overlapping each other every single time we want it to look like the player's running. So we're going to try and do it that way instead. We're going to need a script in order to do so, so we're going to right-click on our scripts folder, create a C# script, and we'll call this repeat background, in order to repeat our background. And now with this script, we're going to drag it and drop it onto our background object. And then we're going to make sure that it's applied. So now you're going to go into your scripts folder, make a repeat background script, and then you're going to apply that script onto the background. Now it's your turn. Cool, so we've taken our first steps in fixing this problem that we created for ourselves by making this background move to the left until it disappears. So we have our repeat background script, so we're going to go into that script by double-clicking. Now, in our repeat background script, we're going to create a variable for ourselves to make things a bit easier. So this will be a private variable, so we can just change it in our code if we need to later. It'll be a vector3 because we actually want the position. And in this case, we're actually going to be getting the position that our object starts at. Now, this will be very helpful so that we know where we should reset our background when it reaches the point that we need to put it back and make it look like it's repeating. Now what we're going to do is actually in our start method, we're going to set our start position. And we're actually just going to get all of the coordinates of our transform position. And now we need to check to make sure that whenever we get to a certain position, we can reset our background to go back to our start position. So we're going to use an if statement to do that check. Now we're going to want to find the current position of our background. So we're going to use our transform position. And since our background is only moving on the x-axis, that's the only position we actually need to check against. Now we want to see whenever our current position becomes less than our starting position. But specifically, we want to make sure that our background is farther down the line on our x-axis before we reset the position of our background to be the starting position again. So we'll just use an offset for now, and we're just going to use like 40, I think. We'll see how that works. And then if we create a new line, and then we use the curly braces, in our if statement, we're going to set our transform position that it's currently at, and we're just going to reset it back to the position of our variable. Now, in Unity, we'll see how this works and how this looks. So, whenever our current position hits a certain point past the start position, it'll reset itself. So that looks kind of okay. It looks a little weird. It kind of looks like the background is stuttering in some ways. Let's see if we can fiddle with that number just a little bit more. Maybe we'll set it to like 50 so it's farther down the line. So we'll change the variable to 50. And we'll save that, and then we'll see how that looks. So now, hopefully our background can go a little bit farther down before it resets itself. And it looks a little bit better. It's getting almost there, but I think that's good enough for now. So what we'll do is, in your repeat background script, you're going to create your own variable for a coordinate. So you're going to use a vector3, and that coordinate's going to be your start position of your object. In the start method, we're going to set the start position equal to the transform position, the current position of our object, exactly where our object started at when it was in the scene. And then we're going to check in our update function to see when our current position is less than our start position and a little offset. Then we'll reset the entire position of our object back to our start position. Now it's your turn. All right, so we've made it so that our background repeats every time it goes back through, but it does look a little bit weird. It's not exactly perfect. You can definitely tell that something's wrong here, but at least our player jumps and they're still happy, so that's good. So in order to make our background transition seamlessly back and forth, we're going to use some new variables to be able to do so. But first what we want to do is we're actually going to use one of our box colliders to help us with this problem. So on our background, we're going to add a component, and then we're going to look for a box collider. And now you see that our box collider wraps entirely around our background, which is perfect, because once again, that means that there's less that I have to do myself to wrap that box collider. And you can see on our box collider in our inspector, it actually has a size. And that is extremely helpful because now we no longer need to guess what the halfway point is of our background. So now in our repeat background script, we're going to use another variable, and this one will be private since we know exactly what we need now. And it'll be a float since you saw the size had some decimals in there. And we're just going to call it the repeat width. And so this will be the width that we actually repeat at when we want to reset our position. In our start method, we're actually going to set our repeat width. So we'll use repeat width. And we're going to set this to the size of our box collider. Now, because our box collider is a component, we're actually going to need that getComponent method again. So we're going to getComponent. And now we need that left and right caret so that we can get the type of component we're looking for. So in this case, we're looking for a box collider. And then we're going to use our parentheses since this is a method. So now we're getting the box collider on our object. And what we want to do is we can actually get the size property of that component. So if we type in size, and then we get the actual X size, so then we can get the total width of our background. And we're just looking for that exact halfway point. So we'll divide using one right forward slash by 2. And that'll give us half the size, half the width of our background. And then last but not least, the only thing we need to do is get rid of this hard-coded number right here. And this will be our repeat width. So now when we save, now that we're back in Unity, you can watch as our happy little player runs through the scene, and it looks like even though you can see the scene moving back and forth in order to make it look like it's repeating, in the player's view, it looks exactly perfect. So now it's your turn. So what you're going to do is you're going to apply a box collider on your background, and then in our repeat background script, you're going to create another variable, a private float called repeat width. You're going to get your component of your box collider in the start method, and you're going to get its specific size and only on the x-axis. And then you're going to divide by 2, so that way you can get the exact halfway point of our background. And then you're going to change your hard-coded number to be repeat width. Now it's your turn. So our game's looking really good now. So we have the background that scrolls endlessly. We have our happy player who jumps through the forest as they're avoiding all these obstacles. And now what we want to do is we want to actually make it so that we can end our game and send it to a game over screen. So what we're going to do is we need to figure out how we can actually label all of these different objects so that whenever our player collides with them, we know what we've hit. One really cool way of doing this is by using something called tags. So if you look at the top right of our inspector, we have our ground selected, and there's this little button called tag. And what we can actually do is create different tags for different things. So we could actually go and tag our player as player, tag our main camera as our main camera. We can tag locations, different things like that. So we'll actually create our own tag by clicking add tag under that dropdown. And you'll see that there's a tag here that says list is empty. So this is our list of tags that we can use that we created. We haven't made any yet, so we'll actually go to this little plus sign on the bottom right of this bar. And we'll click that and we'll add our own tag. So we'll call this one ground. And then we can press enter to save. And now when we go back to our ground, oh, that's weird. So what you actually have to do is you go to the tags in your inspector, you click the drop down, and it brings up all the different tags, and then you select the tag that you want to use. So it doesn't, unfortunately, automatically tag something when you create the tag. So you just have to make sure you go back into whatever you want to tag and apply the appropriate one. We're going to do the same thing to our obstacles, but in this case, since we have prefabs, we need to, and we already have our ground. So now we need a way to detect collisions. In this case, we are detecting a collision on the ground. So in our player controller class, this is actually where we'll just store the state of our game over. So we'll just make a public Boolean for now. So that way we can see when our Boolean is true or false. And we'll name this game over. So now we have our game over state saved. And we're actually going down, and you can see that we conveniently already have a way to track collisions against other things using our onCollisionEnter method. So this is actually the place where we can compare the different tags whenever we run into those objects specifically. So we'll start actually with the ground since we already have this variable here. So if, and then our condition, we're going to use collision, because in this case, the collision is actually the object that we're colliding with. And then we're going to call that collision's game object. And on that game object, we can compare the current tag that it has. And we can actually use a string for that tag. So we named our ground ground. Now, in our statement, we can specifically check when we collide with a certain game object. We can check that game object's tag and see if it's ground. So now we'll take our isOnGround variable, and this is where we set it to true. And now, after we've compared for the collision of the ground, we can actually compare for the collision of our obstacle. So we'll actually use an else statement. So else, if what we're colliding with is an obstacle, then we'll do this thing. So we'll check first if we're colliding with the ground. Otherwise, if what we're colliding with is an obstacle, we'll do this. So we can use a debug.log statement so that we can see in the editor in the game over, default value is into Unity, pops up and tells us rules, and there's one. Ooh, missed it. To make sure on your ground that you add a ground tag by using the drop. Do is you're going to go and you're going to apply it as well. To apply the tag, we're going to change some of our code before you leave the prefab editor. And then in your player controller script, you're going to create a collision as our game over editor in Unity that the game is now over. Now it's your turn. Cool, so we have our character in the scene, and whenever we run between our scripts to be able to know when to stop the game. Now, in our move left script, how exactly are we going to know what's happening in our player controller script? Well, for now, we'll create a variable so that we can hold a reference to our script. So, specifically, because our player controller script is a class called player controller, we actually just call player controller. Now, this is very similar to how you would just call game objects, but in this case, we're just calling a player controller. And we'll name this player controller script. And although not very creative, is very descriptive, which is incredibly helpful. Now, in our start method, this is actually how we're going to connect our reference to our script to the actual player controller script in our game. So we're going to use our player controller script, and we're going to set this to the player controller script on our player. So we can actually use the game object class, and in our game, we're going to find the name of our object, which in this case in our game is called player. So this will find player in the scene hierarchy. And now that we've found our player, we can actually get their component. And we're looking for specifically their player controller object, which we put inside the left and right carets. And then since this is a we collide our script, game over, enter, and we can variable public is false, and we're our player controller script to set our scene. And then our game over happens. Player controller, running in our if statement. You can see the controller over, then it stops. If statement, if you can see that that our player hits our obstacle. So we're almost there with the mechanics of our project, but we do have one last small problem to deal with, which is whenever we jump over one of our obstacles, you can see that they just fly off into the distance forever, and so we actually need to get rid of them because otherwise they'll just keep creating obstacles, and then it might slow our game down. To do that, we're going to go into our move left script. We're going to get our current objects transform, position, and on the upside, the obstacles, we're going to destroy our game object whenever they go past the end. I broke. So we didn't use, since our background is using move, and we'll just get the tag like this because this doesn't actually exist yet. So we'll make this very, and we have the obstacles delete themselves. So perfect. Now we have all of the mechanics country, and we're going to go into our update method, current position, and make sure that it's an obstacle game object. Now it's your turn. Cool. So, to wrap up everything that we did in this lesson, which was a lot, we basically finished all the functionality of our game. So, we have the endlessly scrolling background that always repeats itself, and then we have the player jumping, and when they hit one of the obstacles, it ends our game with a game over. And then we fixed that little bug that's constantly spawning all of these obstacles back here, as well as keeping track of all of the obstacles that fell off. So now we can keep our game running as efficiently as possible. On top of that, we used a repeat background script to be able to get the width of a box collider that we applied to our background, so that way, whenever the background goes past a certain position, it'll just reset itself and make it look like it's endlessly scrolling. In addition, we learned how to get references of other scripts in our scene, as well as figured out how we can find those scripts so that we can actually use the variables in that script to be able to control the state of our game that we can use is equal to false use tags to only do things when we have a character here. So we're going to do some work with animations. See you there.